The story of Jesus and the fig tree is presented differently in each of the three synoptic Gospels. The Gospel of Mark is often considered to be the first of the Gospels that was written down, and in it the story of Jesus and the fig tree comes in two parts. The first is Jesus is on his way into Jerusalem, where he will drive out the money changers. The second part occurs the next day, when he and his disciples are on their way back to Jerusalem, and the disciples notice that the fig tree which he once cursed is now withered and died. And so they are amazed. In the Gospel of Luke, instead of a story about Jesus cursing the fig tree, it becomes a story told by Jesus as a parable. There the tree does not wither and die, but the parable comes with a warning that the owner of the fig tree is going to rip it out by the roots if it doesn't bear fruit soon. And in Matthew, the cursing of the fig tree has an immediate effect that amazes his disciples. How did the fig tree wither so quickly, they asked Jesus. And Jesus told them that if they just had more faith, they too could curse fig trees and throw mountains into the sea. That seems like a dubious and destructive aspiration to hang all your hopes on. And in fact, the story is very confusing. Jesus seems to curse the fig tree basically because he was hangry. That's a made-up word by some candy company. His hunger made him irritable, and so Jesus took it out on the fig tree. That may actually fit into the context of the Gospel of Mark, wherein Jesus comes to the temple expecting a spiritual experience and finds it to be more like a trip to the local bazaar. He expresses his disappointment by overturning the tables and driving the money changers out. So he definitely was hangry. Jesus expected something more from the fig tree and something more from the house of God than he actually found. He expected there to be at least some fruit among the leaves. If not ripe figs, well then at least the first fruits, small berries, that always preceded the actual fruit that came much later in the season. A little context from the Old Testament might help us to understand all of this. In many places in the Old Testament, the fig tree serves as a sort of symbol for God's people. The prophet Hosea writes, "When I found Israel, it was like seeing the early fruit on the fig tree. But they consecrated themselves to that shameful idol and became as vile as the thing they loved." Hold on to that thought for the moment. Jeremiah warned them in his day that "I will take away their harvest, declares the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine, there will be no figs on the tree, and their leaves will wither." That sounds kind of like what happened to the proverbial fig tree. But all the symbolism here has to do with God's expectations of his people. The prophet Micah famously described what God expected from them. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." They sometimes call this the Micah mandate. For all the gifts that God has bestowed, God expects us to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God to guide us. A life lived in that way is pleasing to God and will produce the sort of fruit which God desires. It is all about God's expectations. I think about 98% of what we perceive as God being angry with us is really just God wanting to bless us, which cannot happen if we aren't walking humbly with our God. Maybe 2% of the time God really is angry, and why shouldn't he be? Hosea is right. If we choose to love what is vile, we are going to end up as vile as the thing we love, something God cannot. Then there can be no fruit in our life that is pleasing to God, and therefore God will act against us for the sake of his own people. It matters not, then, if we have a lot of fig leaves, if we do not also bear fruit. If that is the case, then we are just a waste of sunshine and water. As Paul said, "This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God." So back to that withered fig tree. It is symbolic, I think, of Israel and symbolic of their wasted existence. Like much of the New Testament, it views that moment in time in Jerusalem as a lost opportunity. The Son of God came to the temple, and there he found no fruit. This story of the fig tree is a warning not to mistake God's charity for complacency. I guess the phrase that applies is that we reap what we sow, or rather that what we don't sow, we can never reap. A life spent humbly walking with God will bear fruit in time. A life that is not spent walking with God will perish without hope. All of the Gospels, of course, were written later, by which time they had seen Jerusalem destroyed. Jerusalem failed to be what God intended, and so it was burnt to the ground by Rome. Don't mistake that for some sort of tactical failure. It was a moral failure, one which doomed them to destruction. They were no longer under God's protection because they were no longer seeking the righteousness of God by acting justly. They no longer loved mercy, and they no longer walked humbly with their God. And no, not everyone in that city was complicit in that. The innocent suffered as well, of course. That is what happens in this world. I believe that God deals with the fact that the sins of the few or even the many may cause the innocent to suffer too. He does so by providing an abundance of his love and grace and an eternity that follows. God has his own plan for separating the sheep from the goats, eventually. Meanwhile, let's look at what Jesus told his disciples that day. His answer seems kind of out of place at first, but it makes sense in the broader context. They would need some way to become more than just a fig tree that was all leaves and no fruit. Think of it as the difference between being religious and walking every day, day by day, with God. They're not one and the same. If religion is the opium of the people that lies at the heart of a heartless world, as Karl Marx once said, well then, true faith is the heartbeat of God within us that brings true life. Faith follows Jesus. It makes us weep and it makes us act to do whatever we can to help others. The Jesus mandate is to love God enough to learn the ways of God, but then also to love our neighbor as we would love ourselves. What Jesus tells us is that faith is the necessary ingredient we must have to live in this world and not to be defeated by it. Indeed, if we want to change this world, then we can only do so through faith. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, "Go throw yourself into the sea," and it will be done, Jesus said. In other words, yes, this faithless world can be changed by those with enough faith and trust in God to do so. Worthless fig trees can be uprooted and fruitful trees planted in their place. Whole societies can be changed, but perhaps even more important, we can be changed. The worthless parts of us can be replaced with better things that are not so vile, and we can become bringers of light and bearers of fruit. Because if you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. That is not Jesus handing us a credit card and saying, "Go and do whatever you want with it." That is Jesus reassuring us that forgiveness is possible and that we can make a difference in this world because real faith connects us to God and to each other. What this world has too much of is a sort of artificial substitute for real faith. which connects us neither to God nor to each other. It merely dulls our senses. It need not be that way. In the Gospel of John, there is no fig tree, but there is the same Jesus mandate to go and bear fruit. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener, Jesus said. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Notice the parallel here. We can ask for whatever we wish, and it will be done, but only if we remain in Christ, and his words guide us. The death of a fig tree is a reminder that life is a gift from God, and apart from God, there is no life. The fig tree died the instant God's spark of life was removed from it. The church in each of us also carries such a spark of life. We are guilty, however, sometimes of forgetting that the point of planting seeds is the crop that follows. God has planted the seed of faith inside of us and wants it to grow. We must do those things that will help it to do so, or else the cares of this world will take priority, and we might forget to water it altogether. If we are not careful, we may even choose to give ourselves up to some idol, some other pursuit in this life, and like Hosea said, become as vile as the thing we have loved. If then there is no fruit, won't God just eventually give up on us? Maybe, maybe not. The whole gospel is a story about just how far God is willing to go to redeem our souls. But I still wouldn't push God too far if I was you. It is better to get connected to the vine now and to begin to produce some fruit of righteousness for the Lord while you still can. It doesn't have to be a bushelful. Just a few figs will do, for starters. And if you doubt your ability to bear any fruit at all, well then just ask, and that ability will be given to you. Every obstacle will be removed, and everything that holds you back will wither away. And then you too can give God the glory through the life that you live by the grace of Jesus Christ our Lord. Be safe, and God bless you.